I'm speaking to you from Glucksman Ireland House at New York University, and as part of a course I'm teaching on literature as history, Ireland 1880 to 1940. I'm doing these weekly short video summaries of the material that I'm teaching here that may be of interest to a wider audience. So today is the second seminar, and it deals with the career of Charles Stewart Parnell, the great Irish political leader of the late 19th century, and the extraordinary extent to which Parnell captured the imagination and attention of our two greatest writers, William Butler Yeats and James Joyce. Now, Parnell was a very unlikely figure to be an Irish political leader because he came from a landlord background. He came from part of the Protestant ascendancy in Ireland, who in the main were not hugely sympathetic to Irish nationalist aspirations, and yet he became the leading political figure of nationalist Ireland in the second half of the 19th century. And I would say the most consequential political figure in Irish history during that period. So how did this happen? Well, Parnell became the leader of the Irish Party in 1880, having succeeded Isaac Butt, who had led the party for the preceding period. Now, Butt was an older politician from an earlier era. He was more conservative than Parnell and his contemporaries, who adopted a more aggressive brand of nationalism as part of their struggle to achieve home rule for Ireland. In particular, they engaged in obstructionist tactics at the British Parliament in order to try to force the hand of the British government to concede reforms to Ireland by way of home rule, but also land reforms to the benefit of Irish tenant farmers, which was a major issue at that time in the latter part of the 19th century. Parnell was born in Wicklow and was educated mainly in Britain, but he was elected to the British Parliament, to the Westminster Parliament in the 1870s, and quickly became a leading figure among the younger generation of parliamentarians who were more radical and more willing to rock the boat at Westminster than their predecessors had been. And quickly, Parnell became the party leader in 1880. And not only that, but he also became the leader of the Irish Land League, which in the late 70s and early 1880s created great upheaval in the Irish countryside. And in fact, Parnell and some of his supporters were jailed because they were suspected of fomenting violence in rural Ireland. It was a period when Ireland appeared to be teetering on the brink of some kind of revolutionary upheaval. And Parnell was jailed, and eventually the British government passed the Land Act of 1881, and things calmed down. But then you had other things that happened during the 1880s. For example, the assassination of the Chief Secretary of Ireland, Lord Cavendish, and his assistant in the Phoenix Park in 1882, the year of James Joyce's birth, and that weighed heavily on Parnell because, of course, he and his colleagues in Parliament were suspected of having sympathies with the Fenians who carried out those killings, and many British people suspected that Parnell was in cahoots with the Invincibles, who were responsible for killing the Chief Secretary. Some years later, indeed, a letter became public which appeared to show that Parnell had encouraged the Invincibles, or was in contact with the Invincibles before they carried out the killings. That turned out to be a forgery, and of course Parnell emerged from that crisis triumphant. Then in 1889 he was named in a divorce case, and it became public that he'd had a long affair with the wife of one of his erstwhile parliamentary colleagues, Captain William O'Shea. His wife, Catherine O'Shea, had a long-term relationship with Parnell. Eventually they married in 1890 after Mrs. O'Shea was divorced from her husband, but sadly Parnell died in 1891 at the age of 46, so really before he had really reached his prime and before he had been able to deliver on the promise of home rule that he had dangled before the Irish people. And Parnell's death was a huge blow to people in nationalist Ireland, because the hopes had been built up that this great political figure could deliver home rule for Ireland. Now, the home rule idea didn't die with Parnell, because it continued to be on the political agenda throughout the following 20 years after Parnell's death. And finally, the Home Rule Act was passed in 1914 and was due to become law when the First World War broke out, and the implementation of Home Rule was deferred until after the war, by which time, of course, everything had moved on in Ireland. The Easter Rising had taken place, and Home Rule no longer satisfied the aspirations and demands of the Irish people. But back to Parnell, his key achievement was to bring together the different strands of Irish nationalism. As I mentioned to you, he was president of the Irish Land League that pushed for land reforms in the 1880s. He was also one of the honorary secretaries of the Gaelic Athletic Association, another organisation that developed to try and create a new spirit of national pride in Ireland through Gaelic sports. And he was a very effective political strategist. Now, he wasn't apparently a great speaker, wasn't a charismatic speaker. He didn't, like O'Connell was constantly on the go, giving speeches all over the place. Parnell would withdraw from public life for long periods when he was spending time with Mrs. O'Shea, and then he would come back again. So he was an unusual political figure, certainly. And Oliver MacDonagh, who was a distinguished Irish historian who taught me in Cork back in the 1970s, has written about Parnell. He was a removed and mysterious hero. He had an enigmatic lure. And during his lifetime, and indeed in the years since, there's been great mystery as to how Parnell managed to achieve such ascendancy in Irish politics, given that he didn't appear to have huge political gifts of charismatic presence or great novel ideas. But he was a great political strategist, and he did achieve something that no other politician had managed to achieve, and that is to convince one of the major British political parties, the Liberals, to support Home Rule for Ireland. When Gladstone announced in 1886 that he proposed to support Home Rule for Ireland, he put a bill forward in Parliament, which of course had the support of Parnell and his party, but which split the Liberal Party down the middle. The bill failed, and the Liberal Party split, and Gladstone lost office, and the Home Rule movement, the Home Rule cause, was stalled. Home Rule came back again in 1893 when Gladstone, on this occasion, got it through Parliament, but it was blocked by the House of Lords. But meanwhile, of course, Parnell had departed from the scene with his fall as party leader and then his subsequent death. But nonetheless, achieving this, of persuading Gladstone to back Home Rule, that was something that hadn't happened before. Now, of course, comparison can be made with Daniel O'Connell in the early part of the 19th century, and indeed going back again to Oliver MacDonagh in an essay he wrote about Parnell and O'Connell, he made the point that Parnell built on the legacy of O'Connell, and he made the point that, quote, Parnell's great parliamentary decade, the 1880s, was in many ways the evening performance of O'Connell's 50 years before. The big difference was that O'Connell was unable to persuade any significant number of parliamentarians or politicians in Britain to support the cause of Home Rule and ending the Act of Union and restoring the Irish Parliament that had been there before 1800, whereas Parnell took advantage of the intense competition that there was between the Liberals and the Conservatives in the 1880s in order to put pressure on the Liberals, on Gladstone, to come out in support of Home Rule for Ireland. Now, to turn to the extraordinary appeal that Parnell had for Irish writers, Joyce in particular was a very big admirer of Charles Stewart Parnell. And that was, he took that from his father. His father, John Stanislaus Joyce, was a devoted Parnell supporter. And indeed, in John Stanislaus Joyce's entry in the Dictionary of Irish Biography, the point is made that when Parnell fell from power, John Joyce's life fell apart and he never recovered the promise he'd had in his earlier days. And he's an example of how the hopes that Parnell had raised in Ireland were dashed by the fall of Parnell and the split in the Irish party, which of course made the achievement of Home Rule far less likely. It's possible that had Parnell achieved Home Rule in the 1890s, that John Joyce could have become a significant figure. Instead, John Joyce declined to the point where his career went totally off the rails, and he ended up as a fairly hopeless character, unable to care for his family. The family had to constantly move home and so on. But that didn't take away from the fact that John Stanislaus Joyce, John Joyce, was a big supporter of Parnell, and his son James took that admiration for Parnell from his father. Now, Joyce wrote in Dubliners. He wrote about Parnell in a story called Ivy Day at the Committee Room, in which 12 years after Parnell's death, on the anniversary of his death, members of the Irish Party gather in a room. They're doing canvassing for an election taking place at that time, and they discuss Parnell. And eventually Joe Hines, one of the characters in that story, and also a character in Ulysses, reads a very emotional poem that he had written about Parnell, Ireland's dead king. And that demonstrates really the power that Parnell's image and memory had even 12 years after his death. And then in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, you have a very gripping scene written by James Joyce, set around the Christmas dinner table at his home in Dublin, and his father and a friend of the father's, Mr. Casey, end up in a furious row with another guest around the dinner table, Mrs. Dante Reardon. And Dante Reardon is a devout Catholic, and she says the bishops were right to go against Parnell. They were right to do him down because he was immoral. He had behaved abominably. Whereas, of course, for Simon Dedalus, the name that Joyce's father is given in the novel, and for Mr. Casey, Parnell was a hero, and they condemned the church for having abandoned and betrayed Parnell. So there you have again an illustration of just how big a deal it was when Parnell fell from power in 1891, and how it divided people in Ireland in ways that you rarely see. And other reports or other accounts of that period confirm that, in fact, it was a huge thing, and it split families down the middle, those who were for Parnell and against Parnell, and that legacy continued. And the Irish Party was split for 10 years, and in a way never recovered the status it had during Parnell's lifetime. And then in Ulysses, you have multiple references to Parnell in the Hades episode. Some of the mourners at Paddy Digname's funeral talk about going to visit Parnell's grave. There's discussion about whether it's really Parnell who was buried there, or maybe Parnell didn't die at all. He was spirited off to South Africa and he might come back again. And that theme continues through the novel. It's discussed again in the Eumaeus episode set on Buttbridge, at a cabman shelter in Buttbridge, where again there's discussion of Parnell and the way he fell from power and so forth. So throughout Ulysses, and even though Ulysses is set 13 years after Parnell's death in 1904 and was written 30 years after Parnell's death, nonetheless Parnell features very strongly in Joyce's work. And Joyce, when he was living in Trieste, he wrote a series of articles for a local Italian paper, and he wrote one about Parnell, and he talked about the extraordinary personality of a leader who, with no forensic gift or original political talent, forced the greatest English politician to follow his orders, Gladstone. He added that the influence of Parnell exercised over the Irish people defies the critics' analysis. Joyce had a very perceptive, a very well informed assessment of the career and the achievement of Parnell. He made the point that Gladstonian liberalism, according to Joyce, was an inconstant algebraic symbol whose coefficient was political pressure of the moment and whose exponent was political advantage. Joyce's take on Parnell recognised his capacity to bring together the different strands in Irish nationalism, the land activists, the parliamentarians, the more moderate people, and also the Fenians, those who were more supportive of direct action to achieve progress for Ireland. And he made the point that Parnell, convinced that such liberalism would only yield to force, united every element of national life behind him and set out on a march along the borders of insurrection. And that, I think, is true, that Parnell always maintained a peaceful path. He never joined in the Fenian movement or never became a supporter of violence, but yet he always could dangle before the British government the threat that if concessions weren't made to Ireland, that violence might well be the outcome of that situation. Now, W.B. Yeats also wrote about Parnell, including in a poem that Yeats wrote in the 1830s, when Parnell was already dead for more than 40 years. And the poem is called Come Gather Round Me, Parnellites. And here is how the last stanza of that poem goes. The bishops and the party, that tragic story made, a husband that had sold his wife and after that betrayed. But stories that live longest are sung above the glass, and Parnell loved his country and Parnell loved the lass. Now, W.B. Yeats also took an interest in Charles Stewart Parnell. When Parnell died, Yeats wrote a poem, not a very distinguished poem, called Mourn and Then Onwards. And he supported the Parnellite group during the 1890s. Yeats was an advanced nationalist at that time, and the advanced nationalists tended to be more supportive of the Parnellites rather than the anti-Parnellites, who were maybe the more conservative faction and perceived to be dominated more by the church and its opposition to Parnell. But the extraordinary thing is that Yeats had no particular family connection with Parnell the way that James Joyce did. In fact, Yeats's father, John Butler Yeats, didn't care for Parnell at all, because he'd been a friend of Isaac Butt, and he believed that Parnell had acted badly towards Butt and undermined Butt's standing within the Irish party, and eventually brought about Butt's early death by the pressure he was put under by the younger element supported by Charles Stewart Parnell. But in the 1930s, there are 3 poems in which Parnell appears. And remember that Parnell was dead at that stage more than 40 years, and Yeats wrote about Parnell's funeral. He wrote another poem about Parnell, and then he wrote a drinking song, a kind of a ballad almost, called Come Gather Round Me, Parnellites. Now, by the 1930s, Yeats had become very much a fan of the Anglo-Irish tradition, the tradition going back to the 18th century with Goldsmith and Burke and Sheridan and Berkeley, and then on to the 19th century. And he saw Parnell as a kind of an epitome of that tradition. Indeed, when Yeats spoke controversially in the Irish Senate in the 1920s, he talked about the Protestant, the Anglo-Irish people of Ireland as, we are no petty people, we are the people of Parnell. So he tried to induct Parnell as an example of the kind of qualities that he believed the Anglo-Irish community in Ireland exhibited, and that he wanted to celebrate more. Whereas in Ireland at that time, of course, the Anglo-Irish were not exactly, because they were seen as connected with the old regime, they were not exactly as popular as Yeats might have wanted them to be. So he presented Parnell as a sort of an epitome of the qualities of the Anglo-Irish community. And here is the final verse from Come Gather Round Me, Parnellites. The bishops and the party, that tragic story made, a husband that had sold his wife and after that betrayed. But stories that live longest are sung above the glass, and Parnell loved his country and Parnell loved the lass. So W.B. Yeats ultimately comes to the same conclusion as James Joyce. Joyce believed that Parnell had been betrayed by the Irish people, by the church, and by the party. And years later, writing in the 1930s, when Joyce was working on Finnegan's Wake and not really following much of what was happening in Ireland, you have W.B. Yeats reaching the same conclusion, that the blame for Parnell's fall lay with the bishops, the Catholic bishops, and the members of the party who turned against Parnell. Yeats was certainly someone who I think his continued interest in Parnell is, I think, an illustration of the appeal that Parnell had during his lifetime and in the years that followed. So thank you very much for listening to me today, and I look forward to presenting my next talk in a week's time, which will focus on the contribution of W.B. Yeats to the creation of a national literature for Ireland.